Hi, it's Ted Pattison again. I'd like to welcome you back to the Power BI Developer's Guide to Azure AD Security. This is part 3, where we'll be covering developing with the Power BI .NET SDK. Okay, so far we've focused a lot on authentication flows and how we program against the Microsoft Authentication Library. Now let's concentrate more on the Power BI Service API and the Power BI .NET SDK that we use to program against it. Now, what is the Power BI Service API? It is a web service that makes Power BI a platform as a service, a PaaS, as opposed to how most people use it as a SaaS, software as a service. And it's built in open standards, as you know, OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. And most of the web service calls are basically designed in accordance with REST and OData. You know it's secured by Azure AD, and to call into the Power BI Service API, you need to pass an access token. We use it to program things like workspaces, datasets, dashboards. The Power BI Service API is a fundamental aspect of implementing Power BI embedding. Also note that it goes by several names. I call it the Power BI Service API, but there's still a lot of old timers that call it the Power BI REST API. Now, what can you do with this particular web service? Well, we can do things like publish PBX files. You can basically push out a PBX file and then programmatically update the connection details. You can trigger a refresh. You can basically write code to clone content across workspaces. And if you're dealing with embedding, once again, it's an essential aspect being able to program against the Power BI Service API. Now, it's possible to program directly against the Power BI Service API without using the SDK. So here's an example where I have a method called execute get request. And note that my code has to work kind of down at a low level with the HTTP client in .NET. I then have to add an authorization header to my requests and basically parse the access token inside there. One other thing you might note about this is that when you call into the Power BI REST API and it gives you back JSON, if you're going to basically not use the SDK, typically you're writing code to kind of convert the JSON that's returned, into some strongly typed .NET object. Okay, let's go into a quick demo just so I can show you what life is like when you're not using the Power BI Service SDK. So I'm going to open up this class, the Power BI Service API Demos class. And so here I have a low-level method that I've written called execute get request. Now it creates an HTTP client. And then what we have to do is we have to get the access token. Note that this method is going to take both the URL of a REST target inside the Power BI Service API and an access token. And it does the work of basically going to the headers, adding an authorization header and putting in the word bearer, then there's a space, then there's the access token. Now here's the call that actually sends that across the network. So what we can see here is that when I run this application, we're going to run this method right here, which is display user workspaces. So if you're not using the API, you have to figure out what are the URLs of the objects that you want to target inside the API. Next, you have to get an access token, and you have to pass it to a method such as execute get request, and you have to package it yourself. Now, let's go ahead and run this application right here. Note that as I run the application, I have Fiddler running here in the background. So note that here's the request. It comes in and it hits v1.0 my.org/groups. You can see the request coming in. I can see kind of the raw data coming back, and that data is basically structured as JavaScript object notation. And then the one thing I really want to emphasize here is you can see that when we made the call, we were able to add the authorization header. There's the word bearer, there's a space, there's our access token inside. And of course, the little trick, if I want to see the access token, I can simply, in Fiddler, I can say, send this to the text wizard. And once again, there's a little trick where you get rid of bearer and space, so then all you have is the access token. And what we'd be able to do is come down here. I can see there's Ted Pattison inside there. I can also see, what are the scopes inside, so what are the permissions that are inside this access token. Okay, cool little trick. So if you're not using the SDK, your next step is, once you call execute get request, what you get back is basically a string, which is the JSON response. So in our case right here, I've created my own custom classes, PBI Workspace and PBI Workspace Collection. And the idea is that when this result comes back, we're going to use the JSON convert function from Newtonsoft to basically convert that back into a fully typed object. So what you can see here is that when you're not using the SDK, there's a lot more work because you have to worry about making sure you pack the access token in the authorization header, and you have to deal with converting the JSON on the way back. Now, what we're going to be doing is instead of directly calling into the Power BI Service API, which we could, we're going to use a more productive path. And the idea is that we're going to use this .NET SDK that the team at Microsoft has built, and there's going to be simpler ways for me to query the Power BI Service API without having to actually be the one that writes the code that issues HTTP requests and deals with responses coming back. Okay, now if you're going to be using the .NET SDK and you're just getting started, you want to use the latest version, which is version 3. So version 3 came out earlier in 2020. Note that the current version as of this recording is 3.11.1. And also note that if you're moving from an older version and you move from 2.x to one of the 3 versions, that there are definitely some breaking changes. So in V2, we had V2 at the end of the namespace name. Now that's been removed. And also, there's a lot of parameters that used to be string-based that are now GUID-based for passing things like the IDs of workspaces. And so what you'll see is that there are some breaking changes. Some of the main reasons that you want to move to the new version of the API is that there are new features, such as doing a server-side generation of PDF file from a report, or if you want to create an embed token that has multiple resources. So once again, they're adding new features to V3, and if you're using V2 and the feature's not there, it's probably not coming. Okay, now let's say that I want to just do hello world. So the idea is when I use the SDK, I create a Power BI client object. And when I create it, I initialize it with an access token. And we spent a long time talking about how to acquire those access tokens. And then also you need to point it to a service root URL. Now for Microsoft's public cloud, that's https://api.powerbi.com. But if you're using the government cloud or one of the other sovereign clouds, you have to find the particular root for those APIs, which are different. And what we can see from this simple piece of code here is kind of the hello world of the SDK, is that once you get the PBI client object, I can say pbi-client.reports.getReports, and I can basically pull back a value, which is a collection of reports, which I can simply enumerate through. Okay, now earlier I demoed what life was like without the Power BI Service SDK, and now let's look at what life is like with the SDK. So earlier I showed you that without the SDK, we had to create our own execute get request. We had to do things, such as convert JSON responses over to a .NET object. Okay, but now let's go ahead and move over to this Power BI SDK demos. And what we're going to see now is we're going to be able to get a Power BI client object from the token manager class. Okay, in part 2, we talked a lot about the token manager class, but the idea is that you can either get an access token from this class, or better yet, you can get an access token, but have it wrapped in the Power BI client. So now, when we look at the code over here, what we can see is once we get the Power BI client object, I can simply say Power BI client.groups, getGroups.value. I don't have to worry about converting or serializing JSON back and forth into a strongly typed C# object. Okay, let's go ahead and run this right here. And as we run the request, it runs just like before. But now that we have this PBI wrapper, life is going to be a lot easier. Let me go ahead and run it one more time. Okay, and now that we've run it, let's go back here. And what I want to show is that when we look at a call that's made without the SDK, and we look at another call that's made with the SDK, there's really no difference. It's just we get a nice productivity boost because the SDK abstracts a lot of things that we don't need to worry about away from us, and we get to kind of concentrate more on the code that we have to write. Now, another very important aspect of the SDK and the underlying Power BI Service API is that we divide the methods into user API methods and admin API methods. So most of them are user API. And what we mean by that is when we run it, whoever the current user is, that will dictate what you can do. So for instance, using the user API and you query and get all the app workspaces by looking at groups, you're only going to get the workspaces that the current user is a member of. So there's also an admin API. And the idea of the admin APIs is you don't run with a single user permission, you run with something that's more powerful. And so we have a set of methods that has as admin in their name. And the idea is that once you start using these, you're going to have to authenticate and grant a pretty serious permission. And note that in order to authenticate and get this permission, you either have to be a tenant global admin or someone has to have made you the Power BI Service Administrator within your tenant. Okay, and also note that in a second, we're going to talk about app-only authentication. App-only authentication only supports the user APIs today. It does not yet support the admin APIs. Okay, so here's an example of calling into the Power BI admin API. Let's go ahead and kind of see this in a demo. Okay, now we're back at the Power BI public client demo for one last time. In this case right here, we'd like to call into the admin API. So we're going to say get groups as admin. Note that we need a special permission, tenant read all. If we go back to permission scopes, what we'll see here is tenant read all. This is one of the two permissions that requires admin. What does that mean? Let's go back here. Here I am in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Note that for users, either you can be a global tenant admin, or if someone adds you into a special role, which is the Power BI admin role, then you'll have permissions, to be able to acquire this. But note that users that don't have that administrative permissions, will not be able to get this access token. Okay, so now let's go back here. Let's go ahead and run this. And so as we run this right here, the first time, what we should see is we go ahead and we run this, and it should now see that I'm asking for a permission that I've never consented to. And there it is, view all content in tenant. I'll go ahead and choose accept, and the application runs. Okay, and now let's go ahead and run it a second time. And just the fact that we had that token acquired, it's in the token cache. And so now we can just basically pull it out of the token cache. And you can see all the different workspaces that I have. Well, there you have it. Now you know the difference between the user APIs and the admin APIs. So congratulations, you've made it to the end of part 3, developing with the Power BI .NET SDK. Now, let's move onward and upward. Time to move to part 4, developing with the app owns data model.